Romanesque art in Aquitaine. Aquitaine refers to southwestern and western France, and it was a large, powerful, wealthy duchy in southwestern France, bordered by, at that time, Normandy in the north and the territory of the Count of Toulouse on the east in the south. The medieval Aquitaine is much larger than today's region of Aquitaine, which has a number of other regions adjoining it on the north. It was ruled by the Dukes of Aquitaine, or, as we'll hear, Duchess of Aquitaine as well, from the 10th through the 12th centuries. In the 12th century, it came under English rule when the Duchess, Eleanor of Aquitaine, married Henry, the Duke of Normandy, who became King Henry II of England. Aquitaine was lost to the French in the 100 Years' War. Aquitaine is associated with the vernacular love songs of the troubadours and the heroic sounds of the chansons de geste, and the development of courtly love. For example, Duke William IX, it was known as the Troubadour. He was known for his, lechery? His interest in the women, we'll say, and the songs that he recorded. And the earliest surviving troubadour songs were written by Duke William. His granddaughter was Eleanor of Aquitaine. And Eleanor of Aquitaine is one of the most famous women in medieval history, maybe one of the most famous women in history. She was only 15 when her father died, and he died on pilgrimage to Santiago. He entrusted her well-being to the King of France, who promptly married her to his son. And so she became, at age 15, the Queen of France. That marriage didn't work out terribly well. Eleanor was well-educated, headstrong, and seemed to be a bit of a scandal to the court. She decided that she would go on crusade, the Second Crusade, with King Louis IX, her husband. And as I said, the marriage didn't work out too well. They did have 2 children, both daughters, and the marriage eventually was annulled in 1152 on grounds of consanguinity, which meant that they were too closely related. Ironically, her next husband was even more closely related, but that's the way things go if you are an important ruler. She married Henry when he was the Duke of Normandy. And, of course, he became the King of England, so she became the Queen of England. That didn't work out too well either in the middle run, I'll say. They did have 8 children. And 5 of them were sons, and some of them became kings of England. Of course, Richard the Lion-Hearted, Richard I, and King John are both the sons of Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II. But Henry did have, a roving eye, and also, well, more than an eye, but also, that was kind of expected of kings, I guess. Also, the eldest son, Henry, rebelled against his father and brought 2 of his brothers, including Richard, into this rebellion. And Eleanor sided with her sons rather than her husband. The result was that she was confined for about 16 years. She was imprisoned, and I don't mean in a dank dungeon or anything like that. She was confined to a castle, most of the time in England. There were some times when she was able to see her sons at Christmas, and there was actually a period when she accompanied Henry. But for most of 16 years, from 1173 to 1189, she was confined or imprisoned by her husband in retaliation for her siding with 3 of their sons in the rebellion against their father. After Henry died, and her son, Richard I, known in history as Richard the Lionhearted, became king in 1157, Eleanor was released, of course, and she actually ruled England as the regent while Richard was absent during the Third Crusade and his subsequent capture and imprisonment by Duke Leopold of Austria, and the imprisonment by the Holy Roman Emperor Henry, or Heinrich the Sixth. She outlived all but 2 of her children, John and 1 of her daughters. And when she died, she had already retired to the abbey of Fontainebleau in Aquitaine. This particular abbey is rather interesting in history because it's a double abbey, but it's ruled by an abbess. The founder thought that women were better than men, which was totally unusual. It was like the opposite of everything the church was teaching, that women were more evil because they were subject to the curse of Eve. But at any rate, it was unusual abbey. And it was founded in 1100 on land donated by Eleanor's grandparents, William IX and Philippa of Toulouse. And there she died, and there she is buried. I should also mention her association with courtly love. Now, that is a 19th century term, but it was an idea that has had a long history. It's changed a bit over time, but essentially it's a concept of romantic love, where the woman is the object of desire. We like to say she's put on a pedestal. The lover subjugates himself and tries to show that he is worthy of his lady. It is never to be in love with your spouse. You may remember at this time you married or were married, particularly in the case of women, to someone because of political reasons, if you are royalty, or economic reasons. And love doesn't enter into it. In Poitou, and Poitou at that time was part of Aquitaine. We're going to be looking at a church in Poitou, and the Duke of Aquitaine, or would be the Count, and the Duchess would be the Countess of Poitou. In Poitou, Eleanor and her daughter, Marie de Champagne, are said to have presided over the court of love and promoted the ideals of chivalry, manners, and courtly or romantic love, although certainly there's a great deal of debate about what that actually means, whether it's true, or, was it simply a game that they were playing? Did it have serious significance? It certainly had a long significance in history. And to illustrate that idea of courtly love, we have, of course, a work of art. We have a casket with scenes of courtly love. It is from Limoges, France, and the colored work on it is enamel in a technique known as champlevé, which we're going to be talking about later. So at this point, let's just look at the scene of courtly love, where the male figure is playing music, trying to attract the woman who has her hands on her hips. I don't know whether she's very impressed or not. There's a bird flying to her. Does that mean his love? Is his soul going out to her? Just the sound? And then on the other side, we see him kneeling to his lady. In Aquitaine, there are several types of architectural features that are popular. One is the screen facade, which are seen here in this picture of Notre-Dame-la-Grande. And another one is domed churches. Now, you won't always see both in the same church. You might have a church with a screen facade and another church with a dome, which is what we'll be looking at. This is Notre-Dame-la-Grande, Our Lady, the large Church of Our Lady in Poitiers. And Poitiers is the capital of Poitou. The church was erected during the second quarter of the 12th century, and the west facade was created between 1150 and 1170. Poitiers is the capital of Poitou, which was the residence of the Duke of Aquitaine, who was also the Count of Poitou. So the palace was adjacent, was very close to this church. I understand the building is now the Palace of Justice, something like that. The town is on one of the pilgrimage roads to Santiago, and so there may have been some influence coming in from the pilgrimage style of creating a church. The ground plan and the interior are sometimes called a simplified pilgrimage plan, although you will see some differences. And it's created out of limestone, and limestone was a local material. There was a quarry relatively nearby. And this is the very famous west facade. Most books, this is what they show you. They may not even show you the rest of the church. And it has what we call a screen facade or a screen wall, by which we mean that the entire wall is covered with decoration. And you can see it's covered with sculpture. It's covered with arches. You have these arcades, a series of arches that go across at 3 different levels. 2 near the top, and then, of course, the 3 archways over the portal, and then 2 blind arches on either side. This repetition of the sculptural elements gives a very rich appearance, and we want to look at all of these different details, of course. Okay, we want to look at some details of the sculpture, and I will say it's very badly damaged, as you'll see. In the gable at the top, you see a kind of elongated roundel showing Christ surrounded by the symbols of the evangelists and some angels. So this is Christ in heaven. And then you have below that 2 rows of series of arches, arcades. And these are presumably apostles and saints. At the top row, you have 6 standing figures. One of them can be identified, and we'll see this in the detail. It's Peter, and we know that because he holds his key. 2 of them on each end are dressed as bishops, but don't know which bishops. Then below that, there are 8 seated figures. And then you can see this rich decoration with the corbels that separates the upper part and the lower part. And then in the area above the arcades, sort of the spandrels plus, we see scenes from the Bible. These include the fall of Adam and Eve, Nebuchadnezzar, he's labeled, that's how you know who he is, prophets, a scene of the Annunciation and of Jesse. And then on the right side, as we're looking at it, the Visitation and the Nativity, and then there's a small scene that we're not sure exactly what it means. So let's look at some of those details. As you can see, for most of the heads are missing, and the statues are badly worn. At the top, you can see in Christ in heaven, standing with the symbols of the 4 evangelists, the winged man or angel the eagle, the ox, and the lion. And I know you probably can't make them out in this detail, and as I say, they are badly damaged, but there was Christ presiding over all, as it were. And then here is a detail from the next level, and you can see in this detail the figure on the right is holding keys. I don't know if you can make it out or not, but that is St. Peter, who holds the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Then you can see the rich carving on the spandrels and above the arches. And you can see some of those scenes. I think that's the Annunciation right there in the middle. Here you can see them more clearly. All right. Yes, it was. Starting at the far left, we have a scene of Adam and Eve, the fall of man with the tree between them, and then a figure that's labeled Nebuchadnezzar. What is he doing there? I don't think anyone's come up with a completely coherent idea of what the iconography refers to. Maybe that would be a project for someone. We see prophets, and then in the detail, which you can see where the two, the left and the center portal come together, you have that scene of the Annunciation. You can see the angel, and Mary is standing next to him. Next to Mary is Jesse, and you can see all these little curlicues coming out of him. Jesse is known because he is an ancestor of Christ and Mary, and there's a very famous verse in which they talk about Jesse as the root from which springs this tree, and so we often see symbols, a kind of emblematic image of the tree of Jesse. And this is a genealogical tree showing that Christ and Mary descended from David and from Jesse. And then if we look over on the next side, you see the Visitation. You see these two standing figures embracing each other, the Virgin Mary and Saint Elizabeth, both pregnant. And this little city, I guess that's either the city of Nazareth or the city of Bethlehem, one or the other, depending on which scene it refers to. The next scene has Mary lying in bed, having given birth to the Christ child. And then you can see the midwives bathing the child in what looks like a giant chalice or a giant baptismal font. And there is the traditional representation of Joseph sort of seated there with his hand on his fist and presumably looking ineffectual. The idea, though, Joseph sometimes was the butt of jokes in medieval mystery plays. He's the old man whose young wife is pregnant and it's not him. I suppose you could say he was cuckolded by God. On the other hand, the idea is that Joseph then, being incapable of being the father, proves the virgin birth and proves that Christ is God's son. Later on in the Middle Ages, in the late Middle Ages, Joseph became a much more positive figure as the hardworking carpenter husband who cares for his family and is humble and virtuous. And his stock goes up considerably. I think he's a very popular saint in the United States as well. I know several places they had that I've lived. They've had churches of Saint Joseph. You might also want to notice the rich carving in the archivolts. And each one of these stones, the archivolts are those stones that go around the arch. They're also known as voussoirs in French. And each one of these is carved, and then they're placed in place and form decorative friezes. And I found this picture on the web, which I thought was kind of interesting because they evidently have a light show to simulate the original polychroming. Now, they probably don't know exactly how it was originally painted. But once again, I want to remind you that these churches were not dull in color. They weren't just the color of the stone. They originally were painted very bright colors, and this also would make the figures and some of the details really stand out. And here we're looking at Notre-Dame-la-Grande, and we're going to look at the interior as well. And when you look at the exterior, you might notice that it doesn't seem to have a high nave and lower side aisles. And you also notice that you have a blind arcade rather than doorways leading into the side aisles. I should also point out another characteristic of this church, which is the kind of cylindrical towers on either side of the screen facade. And they're surmounted by these cone-shaped roofs with very distinctive tiling. And they're called fish scale tiles. So if we look at the plan, you see there's no transept. It's just a long church with a barrel vaulted or tunnel vaulted nave and groin vaults in the aisles, but the aisles are as tall as the nave. It's a choir with 3 radiating chapels and no transepts. So let's look inside. This is known as a hall church. And a hall church is when the nave and the aisles are both equal in height, rather than a short aisle and a tall nave. And the arcade rises to the vault. So you have no gallery, you have no clerestory. The light is coming in from the windows in the aisles, which you can see here. Now, I also thought this was fun because it's polychromed, but the polychroming is definitely not original. It's 19th century paint. And of course, how accurate is it? Well, we don't know, but that's the 19th century idea of how it might have been polychromed. But just remember that these churches were richly decorated, even though the paint has been lost over the centuries. We're now going to look at another church in the area, Saint-Front, or Saint Front, it looks like. I suppose it's probably pronounced more like Saint-Front. And this is in Pérignon, in France, and it's one of several domed churches. The other one, which they didn't put in your book, and I wish they had because it is very interesting sculpture, is at Angoulême. And although it was a long time ago, I've actually been to the church at Angoulême, but not this one. And you can see the domes, and let's look at a plan. You'll notice that this is a Greek cross plan. And when you look at the aerial view, you see all of these 5 domes rising above from the crossing and from each of the arms of the Greek cross. And it may remind you of something. Okay, this is 1120, a church that you've seen earlier. There's the plan of the Church of San Marco in Venice. And you remember that San Marco was a Byzantine church in style, erected on Western soil in Venice, Italy. And you can see that it is also a Greek cross plan. Now, the narthex, this extra area that is on the western and going up around, I guess I'll call it the bottom in our picture, the western arm, or the body end of the church, that's added later. That's 13th century. So remember that this was a late 11th century, and Saint-Front is early 12th century. Could this have been a direct influence? We don't know. But certainly there seems to be Byzantine influence on these domed churches of Aquitaine. It may be that some of the influence is coming from the east, from Crusaders going to the Holy Land, going through Byzantine territory, seeing domed churches. Let's look at the interior. You'll see a heavy pier. Let's look at the interior. And when you look at the interior, you're seeing the dome rising up from the pendentives, which distribute the weight to these heavy piers. Now, you'll remember that we talked about pendentives when we were talking about Byzantine art. And essentially, when you're standing inside the church, they look like concave triangles. And this is the way that the weight is distributed, that it's the thrust is sent to the very heavy piers. But it almost seems like the dome is floating there. And here at Barringnote, the piers are actually pierced. As you can see, there's arches through them, which gives it a slightly lighter appearance, but you certainly can see them. I should point out that in the Romanesque churches, you see the piers, the pendentives, the walls, the domes. Everything is clearly articulated. And you can very clearly see where one stops and one ends. We talk about that separation of parts in the Romanesque period. And now we want to look at another hall church. This is Saint-Savin-sur-Gartempe. Gartempe is the river, so it's Saint-Savin, who is a martyr, on the river Gartempe. And it's in the area of Potois and was created, around 1100. It is a wonderful example of a hall church. And as you can see, the nave and the aisles are equal in height. The arcade rises to the vault, and you can see this tunnel vault or barrel vault. There's no clerestory, there's no gallery. The light is coming through the windows in the side aisles. And here we see a view of the side aisles, this very tall side aisles. The nave is barrel vaulted. The side aisles are groin vaulted or cross vaulted. You can also see the cross section, this drawing, where you have a couple little people in the center to give you the feeling of how tall this is, and how the center rises up. You will see that the side aisles are just slightly lower in height than the center, but that doesn't disqualify it as a hall church. As you can see, the springing of the vault is the same for both the aisles and the center nave. So the columns are the same height. I was going to say the walls, but you're having columns running completely down the center of the church. And here you see it as the plan. Little transept, radiating chapels. And I want to point something out. On the western end, there is an extra, it looks like an extra rectangle there. That's the narthex, or sometimes it's called the Galilee porch, and we'll be mentioning that. So here you're looking down the nave, and here you see the side aisle. And one of the things I'm sure you noticed was the fact that the church is painted. That the ceiling is painted. They always call these frescoes on the ceiling. Frescoes are painted on wet plaster. But when I was looking into this, I did find a reference that said that they were not true fresco, that they were actually painted a secco or on the dry. I wasn't there when they were painting them, so I'm just throwing that out because, as I say, I found it when I was looking for information about this church. But they are always called frescoes, so we'll continue to call them frescoes. So there are paintings or murals or frescoes on the ceiling. And those are 12th century frescoes from around 1100. As we look at the vault, you can see these frescoes, which have Old Testament scenes from the creation to Moses receiving the law. So for the most part, except for the moment that is the era that begins the era under the law, we're seeing this as the era before the law. In Christian thought, the world history is divided into three parts. The era before the law, which means before the coming of Moses and the writing of the laws in the Pentateuch. The Ten Commandments, of course, and all of the other laws in Deuteronomy and Leviticus. And the idea was after man sinned, God was trying to save mankind, and he sent the great flood. But people continued to sin. And so he sent Moses the laws. In other words, here are the rules. Now follow these rules. Only people didn't follow the rules. People continued to sin. And that era where they have the law, but they're still not fulfilling the law, is the era under the law. And then with the coming of Christ begins the idea of the era under grace. The era when people can be saved because God, according to Christian doctrine, became man in the person of Jesus of Nazareth and sacrificed himself to make up for the sins of all the world. So here we're seeing the early part of the history of the world according to medieval Christianity, which is the era the era before the law and just as the law is coming into being. And I do have some details of these, and I might mention it is fairly unusual to have Romanesque frescoes. There is some survival. It's not entirely unique, but it is unusual. So this is one of the relatively rare survivals of Romanesque painting on the wall. It's also a rare survival to find it painted on the ceiling. So here are some of the details. This is from a scene of Cain and Abel, and here we have God the Father as this tall figure turning toward Abel, and Abel is holding out this, is it a sheep or is it a calf? But this animal, which he is offering to God, and God is accepting the sacrifice, and it's cropped off in this picture, but behind him is Cain, whose sacrifice is rejected. I want you to notice the style of this, the linearity. All of the figures are surrounded with lines, and then the drapery folds are created with lines, often with sort of parallel lines. And sometimes you have all of these wonderful little decorative details, such as the little, looks almost like three little petals or flowers that decorate Abel's garment. You have seen some Romanesque sculpture, and you'll remember often they would have a carved parallel grooves that form kind of linear expression. And so you see the same thing in painting. One is flat, and of course the sculpture is more three-dimensional, usually high relief. And here we see a section of the ceiling, and you'll notice that the sections are divided with these decorative bands to show you each scene separately. And here we have the scene of the building of the Tower of Babel. Actually, it looks like they've just gotten started, but there they are building the Tower of Babel. They're bringing heavy building blocks. And the figures are not of a realistic size. You have a person where you have one person standing together who's very, very tall, and he's also very, very strong. Maybe he's a giant. At any rate, he's able to just hand over a huge building block with one hand while he balances the other on his shoulder. And then you have smaller people where it seems like it's a little heavier for them to carry those building blocks. And then even smaller yet, there's a man in front of the tower who seems to be turning to the figure, once again, of God the Father, who presumably now is going to give them different languages so they can't communicate and cannot build this tower that reaches up to the heavens. And here we have a scene of Noah's Ark. And you'll notice that Noah's Ark has a wonderful animal head at the prow. Does it remind you a little bit of the Augsburg ship prows? Probably reflects the type of boats of the time in which this was created. And then you have all of these different compartments, which are little arches for the different animals. Now, I mentioned the narthex, or the Galilee porch, this projection in the plan at the western end. And here you also have some surviving frescoes. And this shows the last book of the Bible, the book of the Apocalypse, or the book of Revelation. You can see a picture of the one God on his throne, surrounded by a rainbow. And I do have one detail that's very, very interesting. This is the detail that's probably most reproduced from Saint-Savin-sur-Gartempe. This is the scene of the woman clothed in the sun, threatened by the seven-headed dragon. Now, in the Apocalypse, I should explain what that is for those of you who haven't read the book of Revelation. I do recommend it if you are a student of medieval art. There is so much medieval art and so much medieval iconography that comes from the book of Revelation. So, I would suggest that you read it, give it a glance. But this is, the book of Revelation is supposed to be a vision that St. John the Evangelist had when he was exiled to the island of Patmos. And in fact, that figure down there in the corner may be St. John having his vision. He sees God on his throne. He sees the 24 elders of the Apocalypse throwing their crowns upon the crystal sea. He sees the Lamb opening the seven seals. And every time a seal is broken, devastation of various types rains down upon humanity. All of these are, we might call them phantasmagorical. They are not something that you would see every day in your life, walking around campus, going to the store, sitting in your room. They are visionary and presumably symbolic. In fact, people have tried to interpret the symbolism of the Apocalypse for millennia and often bring in contemporary concepts, politics, religion, what have you. For example, during the Reformation period, both the Pope and Luther identified each other as some of the beast or the whore of Babylon or the Antichrist. During the Cold War, some of the people in the United States, not all of the people, but some people thought the great beast was Russia, or was the Soviet Union, rather. Actually, scholars believe that the Antichrist and the great tribulations that fall upon mankind and presumably are wiping out mankind are really Nero, who, of course, had a horrific persecution of the Christians and not much respect for any of the other Roman citizens as well. But we want to look at this picture. Okay, that's some historical background. Let's look at this picture. One of the most familiar scenes from the Apocalypse is the woman clothed in the sun, although oftentimes she's taken out of that context. But the Apocalypse talks about the woman clothed in the sun with the crescent moon at her feet, and she gives birth to a child. And the child is taken up to heaven by an angel. And you see here the angel reaching down and taking the child from the woman's lap. You'll notice that the angel, the child, and the woman all have halos, which denote their holiness. And of course, you can imagine that the woman is identified with the Virgin Mary. And the child was identified with the Christ child. And there is a seven-headed dragon whose tail sweeps the stars from the sky. And the dragon threatens the woman. He pours out water from his mouth. That is not shown here. That may be another scene. He pours out water from his mouth in order to drown the woman, but she is given the wings of an eagle, and you can see the wings coming up behind Mary's halo, the wings of an eagle to fly away and escape the dragon, who is associated with the devil and evil. So you can see that this is very rich in visual symbolism. When you read the Apocalypse, you get pictures in your head, and People throughout the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, right up to the present day, still create many images that come from the book of Revelation or the book of the Apocalypse. And also on the crypt walls, there are additional images of saints, including Saint-Savin. Okay, let's look at a page from a manuscript. This is from the Sacramentary of the Cathedral of Saint-Étienne, St. Stephen, at Limoges in France. And it shows the scene of the Ascension. Now, we've seen this before. We've seen, for example, the Rabula Gospels. And it's laid out in a similar fashion, but the style's somewhat different. We see the apostles and Mary on a bottom level. We see Christ in the upper center, rising up in this mandorla, with angels on either side, and the angels are leaning down, presumably to tell the apostles, men of Galilee, why are you looking up to heaven? Don't you know that Jesus of Nazareth will come again as he went? So the general layout is similar, but certainly the style has changed considerably. It has a very concrete outlines and is much more abstract and has really no shading or no background. It's pretty much a two-dimensional image, except where the feet or the edge of the mandorla overlap the frame or overlap the band that separates earth from heaven. Now, it's sometimes said that this style is a transition between the Byzantine style and the northern style of dynamic linearism. So you can certainly see some active forms with, particularly the angels. From Byzantine art, we mentioned the general layout of where the figures are in a particular Byzantine manuscript. And as you know, Byzantine art often continues to show the same general layout and way of painting a particular scene. Now, the artist would never have seen the Rabula Gospels. I do not mean that at all. What I'm meaning is that there's a tradition of passing on the images in Byzantine art. And by this time, of course, we think of Byzantine art as abstracted, very frontal. Here, Christ certainly is a figure that faces front, and often extremely elongated. And we see this as well, where the figures are sort of tall and slim. We also talked about the northern interest in linearism and that idea of active lines. Here they're very solid lines, but they certainly form some active figures. Once again, I point to the angels, to the gesture of some of the apostles. And there's certainly some interest in pattern here, which is a northern idea. Look at the pattern behind Christ that fills up the mandorla. There's another, perhaps influence, certainly a parallel. We see very bright colors with dark outlines, very, very clear shapes, and these may be analogous to the enamel work that was done in Limoges. And of course, this is from the church of Saint-Étienne at Limoges. Limoges was very famous for its enamel work, and I was able to find a Limoges enamel of not the Ascension, but Christ in Majesty. So similar to a certain extent, it has a mandorla around it, and just to do the comparison, with these bright colors within clearly defined spaces. In this case, the background is gold, but you have, of course, a good deal of gold in the manuscript, but you have this blue background, which also is very popular in Limoges enamel work, which we'll see shortly. I'm going to show you another example here. Here we have another example of the Limoges enamels. This one also dating from the 12th century, a little bit later in the 12th century than the manuscript. But I thought I'd show you the angel forms here. And once again, there's this linearity. The lines here are in a golden color, but you can see these sort of cells of color, clearly defined colors with outlines around them, which you also see in the manuscript. So perhaps it is influenced by the enamel work that is being done in the city of Limoges, where the manuscript originates. Let's look at more of the Limoges enamels. Limoges is famous for its enamel work and its metal work. And here we have a detail of a tabernacle, once again showing a angel with the blue background that I mentioned. You'll notice the blue background is very similar to the manuscript you just saw. And the technique that is very frequently used for the enamels is called champ-levé. Champ-levé is a technique where areas have been hollowed out of the metal. And then, or they have been incised into the metal. That would be the lines. And then they are filled with colored enamel and fired, which of course liquefies the enamel, and then it hardens and forms these areas of brilliant color. Most of these are pieces of metal done on copper. And then to make the reliquaries, tabernacles, and other objects, they often have a wooden core, like a wooden box covered with this enamel work. This is a reliquary from Limoges. It's also known as a chaise. A chaise is simply a house-shaped reliquary. In other words, the way little children draw houses, where you have a house with a little gable and just sort of one shape. And this dates from about 1190, late 12th century. A reliquary is a container for relics, and relics are, of course, the physical remains of a saint, such as a bone, or sometimes it's objects that came in contact with a saint, such as maybe a piece of cloth that they wore. And here is a detail of that reliquary. That reliquary has a crucifixion, and you also see the colored shapes of the champ-levé technique. And as you can see here, the heads are in relief, so those are metalwork. And you also might notice the decorative background. This work is extremely rich. Today, they often classify things that are gold work, enamel work, as minor arts. But that certainly wasn't true in the Middle Ages. These would be the most precious objects. And as you can see, many of them are in the service of the church. They are for the glory of God. And they would probably be much more expensive than some of the things like painting. But since the Renaissance, there's been this emphasis on painting and sculpture as the fine art. And so they've relegated much of the other types of art to the minor art status. But we're not going to use that. I've told you about it, but we're not going to talk about them as minor arts, because this is exquisite craftsmanship, beautiful art. And I wanted to share some of it with you. Now, this particular work of Limoges enamel is depicted in your textbook in a black and white photograph. And it seems to be identified incorrectly. Your book calls it a reliquary. I suppose it could have been used for a reliquary. But the Metropolitan Museum of Art, who owns it, has called it a tabernacle. I'll explain that in a minute. Also, the date is given as late 11th century. The Metropolitan Museum of Art calls it 1220 to 1210, so early 13th century. That's not a whole lot of difference, late 12th to early 13th. There certainly could be a disagreement about the exact date. However, they don't even give the correct measurements. So I wondered if there was a mix-up in what where they got the information. I don't know. But at any rate, I'm giving you the identification from the Metropolitan Museum of Art that owns the work. They call it a tabernacle, and this would be a tabernacle of the sacrament, which is a container for the consecrated host. Now, why do they call it that rather than a reliquary? I think it's because of the shape of it. It is essentially a cubic shape that's a square on the sides rather than an oblong rectangular shape. Now, in a sense, a tabernacle could be seen as a kind of reliquary because it was believed that the consecrated host, this is the bread of the Eucharist, which has been consecrated by the priest, it's the sacramental bread, that this was the body of Christ. And indeed, whenever you found an altar or found a church, you were supposed to have a relic to be encased in it, to be part of the foundation of the church or of the altar. And if you didn't have a relic, you could use a consecrated host because essentially this is the body of Christ. And here you see the tabernacle open. So you can place, if you were the priest, you could place the host within the tabernacle. If you've been to a Catholic church, you may notice that on a certain altar, there will be a red light. And that is to indicate that on that altar is the reserve host, the consecrated host. And you should pay it the honor of genuflecting when you enter that chapel or approach that altar. Okay, this is the other side. Essentially, you have one side has the crucifixion, which you're seeing here. One side has the three Marys at the tomb, which you've already seen, but we're going to look at again. And then on either side, there are human figures. I haven't found an identification of them. They may be saints. They may be symbolic figures. And I would just have to admit my ignorance at this point. But the images on those two sides refer to the death and resurrection of Christ, which is certainly appropriate for a tabernacle of the host. And here we see the crucifixion. We see Christ on the cross, two angels above, almost as though they're holding up the cross, and of course Mary and John on either side. And then these beautiful decorative shapes fill up the space, so it's rich and luxurious and beautiful. And let's look at a detail here. Here is the detail of the crucifixion, and I thought I would compare it to a Byzantine mosaic. Once again, the artist would never have seen this Byzantine mosaic, which, as you know, is in Daphne in Greece, the Church of the Dormition of the Virgin. And it was created about 100 years before the Limoges enamel. In 1100, the enamel is about 1200, early 13th century. But there certainly are some similarities. And, we've talked about artists who repeat the general compositions and pass that down. So there are standard ways of showing certain biblical scenes that then the artist can vary on their own. Of course, as you can see here, not only in individual styles of where the drapery is going, but also just the beautiful decoration of the background in the Limoges enamel. But you have Christ on the cross in a loincloth, and Mary and John, slightly elongated figures on either side. This is the side that's depicted in your textbook, and we've already seen this, but we also have a close-up, a detail of it, showing the three Marys approaching the tomb. This is the way, of course, that the resurrection of Christ has been shown since the early Christian period. It's straight out of the Bible. After the Sabbath day is over, that would be Saturday, Sunday morning, the three holy women approach the tomb and find that Christ's body is not there. Instead, there is an angel. And the angel tells them that Christ has risen from the dead. So it becomes a scene of the resurrection without actually showing the resurrection itself, which of course is not described in the Bible. The appearances of Christ are described in the Bible after his resurrection. later on in art, we'll start to see images of Christ coming out of the tomb. I'm thinking of some in the 14th century. I'm not quite sure exactly when it begins. Once again, you see this love of pattern and decoration, all of these designs in circles, which repeat the circle of the halos, and also the curving form of the winding cloth that is just peeking out of the tomb. You might know that the tomb is a sarcophagus here. Sometimes it's shown as a rock-cut tomb. Sometimes it's shown as a building that resembles the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And in this case, it's shown as a sarcophagus, a kind of coffin. But it's got what beautiful, rich decoration and this white with the gold lines, winding cloth to show you Christ doesn't need that anymore. He's left. He just left it there and went off. And here are the pinnacles from the tabernacle. We've already looked at the angel, which was on top of the three Marys at the tomb. And here, this was on top of the crucifixion scene. It's Christ holding a book, blessing, so Christ in heaven again. And this is a completely, I suspect it would have been cast separately and attached, because it is very much a three-dimensional figure. And then just to show you the other two sides, we have these figures, which are presumably saints. We have a saint holding up a cross, presuming a priest saint, and we have another figure who may be the Virgin Mary, maybe a female saint, on the other side. And one last example of Limoges enamel. In this case, it's a sculptural object. It has certain areas of champ-levé. You can see on the wings, for example, with the recessed areas cut out of the copper and filled with enamel and then fired. And this is a Eucharistic dove. And there are a number of these that exist. It opens up. It's hollow. It opens up, and within it would be placed the consecrated bread, the body of Christ. Also, it was a symbol of the Holy Spirit, and we believe that some of these were hung over altars to symbolize the fact that the Holy Spirit was present. So this gives you several examples of Limoges ivories from the 12th century to the early 13th century.